So stressful to watch a film for the first time with an audience. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Couple little audio glitches there on Estella's first day in Parliament. Yes, interesting. The paint is not yet dry on the piece. It's been very moving for me to be connected to this movement in El Salvador. I traveled around the world telling the stories of social movements in different places, China and India and the Powder River Basin in this country and the tar sands in my country in Canada, and looking at communities on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction and the climate crisis, and trying to understand where are we winning victories, where are new alliances producing unexpected momentum. And I shot twice in El Salvador in 2012. Went down there twice. Really was blown away by the sophistication of this movement and its analysis. And in a way, more than any other movement that I studied in the course of making This Changes Everything, this movement really has an analysis and an approach that I think we can really learn from. And that's why I see them as futuristic figures from whom we really need to learn. And maybe for that reason, they didn't make sense in the film, in the feature film, This Changes Everything. And I had to make, this most horrible creative decision to drop this storyline from the film. And the day that I made that decision with my editor, and I was literally weeping, because you take a huge responsibility when people trust you with the story of this precious collective thing that they've built together over a generation crisis, and just developing this extraordinary community-based approach to these intersecting crises of our time. And I cut them from the film. So I was literally weeping at the editing desk, and my editor put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "We'll cut a film just from this material, and we'll make it our gift to the movement." And at that point, I started to breathe again, right? Now, that was a year and a half ago, and it's taken us another year and a half to get this piece finally ready. Luckily, what is understood in the Bajo Lempa by this extraordinary movement is utterly timeless, and I think is deeply relevant despite all of our changing circumstances. I just want to, beyond my own personal catharsis, and thank you for indulging that, it is exciting for me personally to have this material that I shot in 2012 finally be of some use. Engaged filmmakers and writers, we want to do stuff that's useful. We want to create organizing tools that people can use to spread narratives and frames and analysis and help us all fight better. And I hope this piece will help. But I just want to observe three things that I learned from this movement that I think make it essential material for us to understand from our perspective in North America. First of all, this movement has an utterly holistic response to the climate crisis. They identify as a leftist movement going back generations that the source of the climate crisis is the logic of modern capitalism itself, and that an economy of endless extraction and endless consumption is on a collision course with nature and with our survival. And they understand this, and that means that to be climate activists means dealing with inequality in their community, creating better work, creating a movement that makes life better for people. That's the kind of movement we need, those are the solutions that we need, that building hope and better material conditions on the way to transforming society is the path, and connecting the dots between the economic system we're fighting and the consequences that we're living through and the disasters that they create. And that fundamentally it's about democracy. It's about building power. That community meeting, right, with the kind of pedagogy, the Freirist kind of community education and empowerment session, was one of the most mind-blowing things I've ever experienced as a journalist over the last 25 years studying movements, where you see people living in a peasant society who are actually filtering through their own daily experience the core truths of our time. And they're responding by building community, by building power, and by just making shit better, right where they live. And that community, even in the few weeks that I spent on 2 different film shoots watching them evolve, they're extraordinary in the sophistication of their response. the movement also has a very sophisticated relationship with politics and with the electoral system. And I think that's one thing that does come through in this piece. You see Estella, who is, for many people here know her well, and others have maybe met her or seen her in other contexts around the work of EcoViva. She got dragged into politics. She was the ultimate reluctant candidate. She did not want to do it. And yet she understood that they had reached the limits of what they could do as a social movement. So in the Social Movements Bureau, we spent a lot of time talking about the inside and the outside and the people who are kind of centrist and they move into the political process and those of us who are creating pressure and momentum outside. This movement just does it all. They just do it all. They build stuff on the social movement side. They've sent two of their most powerful leaders right into the electoral process. It's a country like so many in Latin America where the genocidal maniacs of the what we call the dirty war period are unpunished. They're sitting there in the parliament with the former revolutionary fighters, and they have to shake their goddamn hands and do deals with them. And they are prepared to embrace that level of pragmatism without sacrificing for a moment the revolutionary community building and social movement momentum in their communities. Extraordinary sophistication. I mean, like, if we had that in Canada, we wouldn't have a liberal government that was approving tar sands pipelines. So I think that's a really remarkable thing. And then finally, the community at the heart of this movement, Ciudad Romero, are people who, they weren't, most of them weren't fighters in the war, but they were sympathizers. And they had to flee. And they spent a decade in exile. Many of them in Panama from this particular community, but people went to different countries. And they spent 10 years, some of these folks, living in a jungle near, like they had to learn how to make and paddle canoes and fish and do all this stuff that they'd never done. And they had to reinvent themselves and their society in another country. And then they came back and they settled in a place in El Salvador where they weren't from originally. And then they realized that the land the government was giving them was shitty, useless land, and they had to go and occupy other land. So these people, over the course of a single generation, have learned the art of starting over. And I think in a disastrous future that we're going to have to navigate together as human beings, this is an essential skill for the 21st century, knowing how to start over as communities. And these folks have done it like 3 times in a single generation. And so I think for that reason, a story I was not able to communicate in this short piece, we have a tremendous amount to learn from them. And then finally, you know, I went there for the first time because of Marielle and Jeff, whom I met in Santa Fe, and I was whining about how hard it was to find stories that would tell about climate change and capitalism and holistic responses that deal with blah, blah, blah. And Marielle just leapt to her feet at dinner and said, "You have to go to El Salvador." I was like, okay, crazy lady alert. Like, no, you don't understand. My husband and I, for 25 years, we've been supporting this community. They live in a flood zone. I'm like, oh my God, this sounds real. And that's why I went down the first time. And EcoViva, Jeff, this is a special night to celebrate his extraordinary commitment. And so many other people in this room have created an organization in the global north that actually practices solidarity and support without imposing values, programs, or funder priorities. And this is extraordinarily precious. This is precious. Because every foundation in the world talks about how the communities set the priorities. EcoViva actually does it. They operate with extreme humility. And if we're going to understand how to live in solidarity and within natural limits in an economy and a society that makes sense, we need that kind of humility, and we need to know how to learn from the true leaders. So it's been a very humbling experience for me. I'm so delighted to share this with you. Thank you.